Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you a science fiction and fantasy wrap-up. And this time I read a good variety, including several science fiction military books, which I did not think was a subgenre that I enjoyed, but then I read a couple and they turned out to be pretty great, so I have some good recommendations for you all. Whether or not you think you like military science fiction, definitely stick around. I have some great books to talk about, so let's get started. First, we have On Basilis Station by David Weber, which is the first book in a science fiction military series. And this is one that has been recommended to me so many times on my space opera video, and so I finally picked it up, and I'm really glad that you all kept bugging me to do so. This follows a young woman named Harrington who is an officer in this future military, and she is reassigned to go work on this space station. Little does she know that this is basically where people are sent when they are being rejected and just pushed off to the side. It's kind of a demotion without technically being one. And so she is just sent off there, and the expectation is that nothing will happen and she will just go away and disappear. However, you find out right in the prologue of the story that there's actually some significance or political importance to this station in the larger scope of the warring factions. And so you know that different people are eyeing it up in order to gain power and, more importantly, economic stability. And so she possibly is in a position that is actually really important, and the story goes from there. I really enjoyed this one. From the cover of the book, I assumed that this was a lot older of a story, and I was pleasantly surprised when I found out that the main character was a female character, and a really interesting, well-developed one. She is one of those strong female characters, but not in a stereotypical way. I felt that she was very complex and still feminine at times, and just didn't feel like an archetype, and so I really loved her. I'm really looking forward to getting further into the series and seeing how she develops over time. If you're not familiar with the series, she also has this adorable tree cat pet that sits on her shoulder, and I really enjoyed that aspect. The one thing I did not like about her as a character is very petty, but she does not like coffee, so no, she is not a replacement for Holden from The Expanse, but I will forgive her because at least she was drinking hot chocolate, so it wasn't terrible. But I otherwise really enjoyed the story. I will say that there's a lot of talk about the different factions and names and places, but it's also the kind of story that you can just kind of go along with it. So I do think it's reasonably accessible for people that are newer to science fiction, because while there is so much going on, the author is always careful to give you as a reader enough information so that you can follow the basic plot, even if you're not picking up all of the nuances, all of the details that are being sprinkled in. As I mentioned, this is a super long series, so I do want those of you that have read it to weigh in and let me know how far I should go with the series. Should I go all the way? I don't mean to say it that way, but I am always looking for new books to read, and so I am intrigued to keep going. And just let me know, does the series go downhill? Does it just get better? Again, I want to spend more time with the characters, so I'm hoping that she stays as a major player in the later books. Otherwise, if you haven't picked up the series, I would highly recommend it. I had a lot of fun reading it. I thought it was a really good balance between action and political intrigue. And the reason I say that I never thought I was into military fiction is that I've never been into it in real life scenarios. I'm not someone who reads World War II memoirs and all of that, but I just found that this book to be really engaging. And again, because it's very character focused and very relatable, it's not something that will just bog you down with tactical conversations or things that at times could make other books feel inaccessible to me. But really enjoyed this one. Thank you to all of you that kept recommending it in my space opera video until I finally picked it up. Next, I want to talk about Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. If you're somehow not familiar, it's a very popular science fiction book that often ends up on people's favorites list. So I want to actually reread this book because I read it years ago and I remember liking it but not loving it. And to be fair, I do want to acknowledge that I did that before knowing the backstory of the author, so it was simply based off the work itself. This story follows a young boy named Ender who goes off to a military training school. They go through different activities, different simulations, and the story goes from there. Again, I think everyone kind of knows the general plot, so I'll keep it brief. Instead, I want to talk more about my experience, and that's to say that I definitely appreciate this book a lot more upon reread. I enjoyed the complexity of the relationship between the young boys, and this book is definitely rough. It really portrays male bullying and its violence, and it is just a really interesting book, and especially in terms of the relationship between Ender and his brother as well as his sister. And I appreciated so much more this time around. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that I have read a lot more science fiction since then and really see the great themes and ideas that are explored in this book. But I still admit that I didn't entirely love the book, and it's just the fact that this book, while I appreciate it, I just feel like it's not a book that's particularly up my alley based off my very personal niche tastes in science fiction and fiction in general, because I would say this is a very male-centric story, and while I could certainly sympathize with the main character, I've never experienced bullying like that, and female bullying in school is very different. It's very subtle and all, under the surface, and so I just felt like this book was not written for me. So I assume for those of you that have given this 5-star reviews that this book really hit home in more personal ways and really touched you in ways that it perhaps just didn't connect with me. So liked it, appreciated, gave it 3.5 stars, rounded up on Goodreads, but not one that would end up on my favorites list. And again, this is just based off the art itself. I liked it, but I just wasn't as wowed by it. And I gotta say, even the first time reading it, I saw the twist coming from a mile away, so I didn't get that wow experience. And again, I liked it, but I just don't quite know why it's a 5-star read for so many people. So I mean it in a very honest way. If you can share with me why it's so many people's favorites, or specifically your favorite, I'd really love to know so that I can have a better appreciation for the love around this book. And continuing on with more military science fiction, I also read Dauntless by Jack Campbell. And this follows an officer who wakes up at the beginning of the story. He was put into cryogenic sleep. You find out that he was a glorified officer. He was a hero of the war in the past, and then has been woken up again because the war is still ongoing and is not going well for the humans. And so they've woken him up, hoping that he can once again be a leader and turn the tide of the war and hopefully bring a win for humanity. The setup is really fun, if not a little bit rushed, and I will say that the plot at times is a little bit convenient, but the story was also really fun. I really did enjoy the character of Jack. It's interesting, I noticed that the character who is the hero of the story also shares the same name as the author, so I thought that was kind of an interesting choice there. The characters are a little bit flat, predictable, all of that, but it's a story that I just flew through. I understand it's the beginning of a series, so again, for those of you that have read this, I would love to know how far I should go in terms of continuing on with the later books, because I did enjoy it. My biggest complaint is that while I love Jack, I would say that the other characters are all pretty useless, and the setup is basically that everyone else in the military is completely dumb, and he is the only person who is capable of making good military decisions, despite the fact that his information is now years and years out of date. He is somehow the only savior for the possible solution to this war. And again, I found the setup kind of implausible, but regardless of that, I had a lot of fun reading it, and I really can't criticize it. I do think it's very accessible if you're new to science fiction, especially wanting to get into military science fiction, because while they talk about strategy, it's in very layman's terms and was just very easy to follow. So yeah, a lot of fun, a little ridiculous, but I don't care. And I also read Stealing Light by Gary Gibson. This is a story that is set in a far future where humanity has met another alien species, and this alien species has a lot of control over the surrounding universe, and so they are basically controlling how far we are allowed to expand, how much information we have access to. The story is told from the perspective of a pilot who in the story gets some cargo, and based off of what their cargo is, it maybe reveals a larger scope to the story and things get really big and exciting from there. And I will say that I love the setup to the story. I like the idea of an alien species that does not open the gates and show us the universe, but instead really controls us because they are superior in terms of technology and all of that. I think it's a very plausible idea and it's just really intriguing. So love the setup. The story itself I liked, but I will say that the narrative was a little bit fragmented. It jumps around in time and perspective, which I've read plenty of stories that do that, but the way it was done, I had to specifically stop and really focus at each chapter stopping point to see where it was taking place and who was the perspective, because simply reading the text, all the characters kind of read the same and it just was not clear from the way it was written. So it was a little bit messy in terms of execution, but I'm very much intrigued to read more by this author, possibly read more of this series. So if you have read more by Gary Gibson, I understand he has a couple different works. Love to hear your recommendations down below because again, it was intriguing and I would definitely give him a second chance. From there, I want to talk about Machinehood by S.B. Divya. And this is set in a future where humanity has built a lot more artificial intelligence, but specifically what they call weak artificial intelligence, so that they are intelligent to a degree, but not to the effect that you have to worry about a robot uprising. They are just intelligent enough to get the job done. The issue with this, though, is that a lot of these robots and other AI have replaced humans in the job market. And so we follow characters that are struggling to stay employed in this future. And one of the most popular ways to be employed is this almost self-employment, where you basically work as a social media influencer or online personality. And so you have cameras that follow you around and you make your money through online tips. Obviously, as someone myself who is a YouTuber just as a hobby, but still I found that aspect of the story very interesting. And of course, as you know, I love stories involving artificial intelligence. So I thought it was really interesting to see how it was explored in this book. And again, kind of taken only to a certain extent, while I'm used to reading books about highly advanced technology. These ones were still a little bit dumb. Right at the beginning of the story, you have a coffee maker who is smart, but not that smart, and still is not quite able to replace the intelligence and savviness of an actual human barista. And so I like the ideas in this story, but in terms of the execution, this story kind of fell apart for me. I found the narrative all over the place. It just had really cool ideas, but as a story, it was not cohesive. It had conversations around life and abortion and got very topical, but I just felt like the author was trying to say too many things in too many places and just did not pull it together into a really strong narrative, which you know is something I'm always looking for and expecting in my novels. And this one just honestly fell short for me. It's a new release and I just don't think it's worth the hype. Now, switching over to fantasy, I want to talk about the Boneshard Daughter as well as the Boneshard Emperor, both by Andrea Stewart. These are the first two books in the Drowning Empire series. The first book is told over a few different perspectives, one being a woman named Lynn, who is a daughter to the emperor. She is supposedly in line for the throne, although that may not happen. And you find out at the beginning of the story that she has lost her memory, and so she's trying to piece together what happened to her. At the same time, she is somewhat competing for the crown, so she is trying to impress her father. She's trying to learn the magic, and she's an interesting character. I will say that she read quite young because of her memory loss, and so I do think this book would kind of appeal to people that are interested in like a crossover between young adult and adult, but it definitely is adult. And as the story went on, it did really mature up and got a little bit darker. My favorite aspect of the book, of course, was the hard magic system, which I really enjoyed. In a way, it reads a little bit like a coding system, which reminded me a lot of Foundryside by Robert Jackson Bennett, which I really enjoyed. So if you like that, I definitely would recommend this one. It involves the use of bone shard magic, where they take the bone shards of the different citizens of the land and use them to make these constructs. And in doing so, it actually drains the life energy of those citizens. And I like that little twist to it because it makes the system a little bit dark. You also get the perspective of a lovable smuggler who I can't help but compare to someone like Han Solo. He also has a lovable animal companion that comes along, which is a trope I really enjoy in fantasy and science fiction. And eventually the stories do come together, but for most part in this first book they are separate. But it's a really good mystery because again, you have the main character trying to figure out her past, trying to figure out what is going on, and slowly that is revealed. I did see some of the twists and turns coming, but I will say that did not diminish my enjoyment of it, and there were still a few surprises that caught me out of left field and I really did enjoy. I then went on to read the second book, which is the new release, just came out, The Boneshard Emperor. Keep this really spoiler free. I will say that if you like the first book, you should definitely continue on. This book is a solid follow-up. It does expand a lot upon the world and give a lot more information, which I almost didn't expect. I'm so used to middle books kind of just being a bridge between book 1 and book 3 and doesn't necessarily add anything to the story. That was not the case here, despite the fact that this whole series is really built around the mysteries, because on top of everything that's happening, there's also these islands that are starting to drown or disappear within the empire. And so we definitely get to learn a lot, both about the main character, their backstory, all of that, but then also the larger scope of what is happening. My only complaint with this sequel is that there is a romance that is introduced. I will not say how or what, but I did not love that particular choice. I did not like the focus, and it's just not something I personally enjoyed. I don't tend to enjoy a lot of romance in my SFF to begin with, so keep that in mind. If you love a good ship, maybe you'll enjoy that a little bit more than I did. Regardless, I'm very very excited to see this series through, and if the finale lands the ending, I definitely could see this becoming a new favorite series. So highly recommend. Start back at book 1, but definitely worth your time. And I also want to talk about The Liar of Red Valley by Walter Goodwater. This is a book I received from the publisher for review. And this is one I was really intrigued about because I understand that it's fantasy, but I've also heard it described as American modern Gothic fiction. And so I've heard that it kind of leans into horror. It's set in a small town in the United States that is very ambiguous. And we follow a young woman who becomes the town's new liar when her mother passes away. In her role, she is in charge of holding on to all the secrets of the town. There is also a king that resides over it almost as a mayor or leader figure of the community. And it's just a really weird story. I'll be honest, I was looking for something that was going to be a little bit creepier. People have described this as horror. I didn't really see it that way, which is why I'm including it in my SFF reviews instead of my horror reviews. And I appreciated things it was trying to do, but it just didn't really work for me. I think it's just not really a genre that just connected, and I feel like the author was trying to, again, do something very different, which normally is something I get very excited about. I love fantasy that is different and outside the box, but in this case, it just did not work. The pieces didn't come together, and I just didn't find it a very satisfying story. I really hate to say that, but I think that is one you almost just have to try for yourself. I've watched other reviews, and I really thought I was going to love it when I requested it, and it just was not what I expected. It just did not work for me, and I'm just really disappointed, unfortunately. It happens, but it's never a fun experience. So that's it for this video here. As always, I'd love to hear of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself, and help me out by recommending me more military science fiction, especially those that, again, are a little bit more character or plot driven and aren't too heavy-handed in terms of the actual strategy or the battles, and are really just that cohesive story for someone who doesn't have, again, a military background like myself. And for those of you that have read the military series that I mentioned, I would love to know, with all of them, which ones would you recommend me continuing on to the later books, or which ones kind of get better, or which ones maybe taper off and I should just leave alone. I really appreciate your recommendations and feedback. It always helps to guide my reading in the future. If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of science fiction, fantasy, as well as some horror and thrillers, and you can help me out by giving this video a thumbs up, sharing it around online. If you hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.